Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bible and Archaeology Live, a Friday free-for-all. We're happy to have you here as usual. I'm Jordan Jones. I'm here with Dr. Bob Cargill. This is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for anything and everything related to the Bible and archaeology. And this Friday, we're doing that in the most expansive way possible with a questions-only episode. So if you're here joining us live on YouTube, you can submit your question as we go, and that question may get answered. There's many ways to get your questions in. We'll get to that in a second. But Bob, happy Friday. Good to see you. How are you doing today?
I am back from a vacation. I rented a cabin on an island in the middle of a lake up in far northern Minnesota.
Oh,
Uh,
how
so
miserable that sounds.
yeah, I got to see the Northern Lights for the first time ever. So they're dancing around and caught some pike. I've never caught pike. I grew up in California, as you know, so it's like bass and trout. And these pike are like these prehistoric, ugly looking fish with teeth, and I'm like actual teeth. Yeah, so it was fun. The kids got to catch fish. It was great, but I spent every morning writing. So
Mhm.
it was a writing retreat, and I just got to, spend some time in the woods writing, and then take the kids out fishing. It was great.
Well, we're happy to have you back
Yeah.
for the questions. I'm sure the audience is happy to have you back because I see we already have some questions here. So a
Mm.
word about if you're here with us live, or if you're not, how you can get questions in for one of these Friday free-for-alls. There's many ways to be in touch. You can always send us an email or leave a comment with a question, and that's something that may be included. If you're here watching live and you just want to submit a question, we may come to one of those. If, however, you are a Patreon supporter, you can submit your questions in advance, and you know that that question is going to be included in either a free-for-all or made into a whole topic itself. Or if you're here live, you can submit a paid question like JC has here, and those are questions that you can be guaranteed are going to be answered. So I think let's start here with JC's questions from today. And JC, we're going to tag back to a question you submitted in our last free-for-all as well that we said we would come back to regarding the connection, a potential etymological connection between the Akkadian word for wreath and some of what we see on the parapet of the Golden Gate of the temple, which I see is also connected to your questions that you've submitted here today regarding the progression of symbols between the different types, the Proto-Aeolic, Ionic, Corinthian orders, and the capitals that we see in some mosaics, and potential symbolism within some of those, and then the Corinthian capital order that we get on the Golden Gate. So first, if we step back to last week's in the etymology question, I did some looking into this, and again, as we said before, with etymologies, there's always ways that things can be wrestled, or how are you trying to position things. I'm not so sure there's a real clear path for an etymological connection on this one, but this acanthus thing that you're asking about, as you mentioned today and then, is definitely one of these common features when we're talking about Corinthian capital types. And if you're thinking, I feel like that's a name that I know, but maybe you're not brushed up on your capitals, right? If we're talking about these classical styles of capitals, the Corinthian is the one with that very floral top. It's one of those fancy orders of capitals versus something like a Doric that's much simpler. As they progress over time, they get more elaborate. The acanthus leaves are definitely a common motif in the region that gets picked up in these capital types. And interestingly, right, if we're looking for the history of why does this get connected, the supposed history comes to us from a 1st century BCE Roman architect and engineer, Vitruvius, who writes a book on architecture, and he says that the origins of the acanthus with this capital type comes back to the Greek sculptor Callimachus in the 5th century BCE, who saw the grave of a small girl where her nurse had put a basket on top of it, and that acanthus leaves had grown up around that. And it's either a basket or a tile, depending on the version. And so inspired by this, seeing something surrounded by the acanthus leaves, he was then inspired to make this capital type. Again, this is the supposed history for this. In this way, it gets connected then with ideas of rebirth or eternal life or life and death, because the words are also connected with like bristliness and thorns in the Greek.
Mhm.
So we see that coming into these capital types. It's definitely a common motif. It's not unique just to these, but as you're mentioning with the capitals of the Golden Gate, or the Mercy Gate, we do have acanthus imagery there. When does this come to is a debate, right? When there's a long history with that gate of it being opened and closed and developed and destroyed. So exactly when those things come to, we're not totally sure. Regarding the symbolism of them, again, like this with the acanthus, there are some that speculate maybe there is a symbolism connected with this, but others say it's just in the development of style. If you're looking at them from the most simple with the Doric, then as we develop our techniques, we want to find ways to show off that things get brought in, and so we're showing off our skills, and then maybe a story comes back to explain those later to say, hey, look at how good we are. Oh, we're not just showing off. There's a meaning behind this. So a bit of all over the place with you, JC, on that one, but I hope that gives some insight for you. But there are also lots of good texts talking about these capital orders that are available for you, right? If you're looking in Greek archaeological textbooks or handbooks, you can find some good information there as well. Bob, anything to add?
That's a great explanation. No, one of the, and especially the second of JC's questions, JC, again, thank you so much for your support and for these questions. The obvious question is, what is a Corinthian capital doing buried in this wall, especially one that's been shut down, if it's this early gate? And again, the thing that we need to remember, especially with the construction of Jerusalem, is that these gates get rebuilt over time. So there was probably an eastern gate there. Josephus talks about this. There was probably a gate that then gets, I'm going to say rebuilt, but it gets expanded. Remember, Herod the Great does this to the temple itself. He doesn't tear it down necessarily and rebuild it, but he's expanding it while it's there and while it's, so if you've ever seen this in a building, you're building one side, then you're expanding the other side while it's still, if you ever walk through an airport, you see this all the time, right? They're expanding it while it's maybe something like this. This gate gets expanded. Maybe it's Justinian when he's expanding it once it, during the Byzantine period, once it becomes a Christian city, maybe he's adding some of this because they just want it. They want to use the best ideas, the best architecture at the time. And then maybe the Umayyads did this as well. Once the Muslims take over the city, they're willing to use whatever is the best architecture, the best, and incorporate that. So there was a gate there, and then the gate gets rebuilt, and it's rebuilt, and then at some point it gets closed off, and that's how you end up with Corinthian columns and a closed off gate, much, at a period that's probably later than the original gate that was there.
But it definitely is a part of this confusing, when are things coming in, adaptation. Correct. And everybody wants to show off a little bit. Everybody wants to flaunt their wealth and their power and look what I can do. But that, given the history of this capital type, that is something that can lead to debate of, is it as old as some of when it's showing up in different Greek temples, or is it much later that someone is looking back? Because that's definitely a tradition. We look back towards these old temples in Athens and we see how wonderful they are, and we want to mirror some of that style. So it could be later, like you're mentioning, with potentially Justinian reflecting some of that tradition.
Yeah. And one of the other things to remember is, especially once we get into the Umayyad period with the Islamic rulers, when Abdul Malik builds the Dome of the Rock, and his successor, I think it was Walid, I don't quote me on that, but when he comes in, he wants to take credit for building it. So he scratches out his name and puts his name in there. Problem is he forgets to change the date. So we know that it was Abdul Malik early on. So we have a lot of people trying to take credit for things that were done by, imagine this, right? People who aren't in power taking credit for things that their predecessors had done, or people who are the predecessors trying to take credit for things that it's not something that just happens today. It's something that happens, all throughout history. And then once they make that claim, stories get told and woven in, and you get these false histories that get woven together theologically. So then you get these tales passed down. So the tour guides will go up there and, oh, you see this, and then that will become part of the history. And so this is why we have the archaeologists and the architects that will actually say, actually, there's some layers to this. And this is why when you do take a tour of Jerusalem, you want to make sure to get a tour guide with the highest credentials, who will not just tell you all the folk tales, but will actually trained in the archaeology and will give you the archaeological history of the city.
So JC, thank you for your support. We appreciate the questions. And let's jump here, Bob, onto a question from Constellation Pegasus. Thank you, Constellation Pegasus. As we're staying in this thinking about tradition space, let's say, Constellation Pegasus writes, what does it mean again about the Hebrew tradition of writing their history and the Tanakh? Just putting down different stories and mixing them up, like Noah's flood? There are different sources in it, like the priestly source. So I think here maybe if we could tag in, Bob, a little bit, maybe the spark notes, brief spark notes of when we're talking about sources in the Bible, priestly source, what's he talking about? And then some of how are we to view the text, maybe in a style sense as well.
Okay, so two things. One, if you have a moment, go back and look at the interview that we did with Seth Sanders, because about the midway through this interview, we talked about this very thing, that there's a theory that throughout Israel's history, when they finally decided, probably in the exile, probably when the temple's been destroyed, the Babylonians have exiled them, and they started saying, we should probably write down some of our history. We've been telling it orally. I mean, we all know the stories, but we might not survive. So maybe we should write some of this stuff down. Now, of course, some of it's been written down. They have some of these blessings. You find them on amulets. But maybe we should incorporate it into a larger narrative. How are we going to do this? So they start collecting these stories. And as they collect it, they realize that the creation story they get from up north, let's say, from Israel, ancient Israel, is a little bit different from the creation story they get from down south, right? This is probably how you get Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, right? Were Adam and Eve created together, right, at the same time, at the end, after all of the creation of the animals? Or was Adam created first, and then all the animals created, and then, he's bored with them, and they don't provide suitable. And then God says, all right, I got to solve this. He puts Adam to sleep, pulls out a rib, and then this is my Zioni Zevit, quote for the rib. And then he pulls out the rib, and then he creates Eve, and now there's Adam and Eve, right? They had these two different stories. And so what do? Well, this is a creation story. This is a creation story. We'll put it at the beginning with creation. We have these flood stories. Now, these two, they kind of zipped together. They harmonized them and they put them there. And so then what about these stories? Well, what about this Balaam story? Well, let's integrate that in with this. What about the Exodus? Okay, the Exodus should go right about here. And so they kind of put the stories together in what they believe to be this diachronic, this timeline, right? So creation goes back here, Exodus should go about here, and they put them together. Now, the fact that they didn't all line up perfectly, that they logically, they were just kind of slotting these stories into a timeline. And this is our history, and these are our stories, and they wrote them down. Now, after a while, somebody said, this is our history, right? This is real history. These aren't just myths. There's a lot of contradictions here. We got to kind of line this up. And by the way, we have all these different sources. Isn't this authoritative? Wasn't Moses the one that told us this? And so they start to attribute this to Moses. They give it some authority, right? Because nobody cares if, Bob tells you something, but if Moses tells you it, you're going to pay more attention to it. We have the same problem, by the way, with the New Testament, the letters, the Gospels we have in the New Testament. All of the Gospels in the New Testament are anonymous. We don't know who wrote them, right? But if you attribute them to Matthew and to Mark and to Luke and to John, they're a little more authoritative, right?
Yeah.
Same with the letters, right?
With
Paul wrote it, it's a big deal. If you attribute it to Peter, even though he probably didn't write it, you're going to pay more attention. Okay. So you attribute this stuff to Moses, and now it comes a little more authoritative, but now it better line up. It better make sense. And that's where you start getting the editing, the redacting, to try to line it up to the best of your ability. And this is where you get these different sources. So you get original sources. The priests come in and say, no. The priest, you know a little bit about this.
The priests have the right version, they would say. They say, no, we've got the correct, we're going to fix some things here.
And why is that? Because when this is happening, right, the temple's been destroyed, the monarchy, all the pro-monarchic stuff is gone, right? There's nobody really there, maybe a few people to defend the monarchy, but the priests are still around, right? There's still this priestly line. And then when the temple gets restored, right, when they're freed from Persia and they go back to rebuild the temple, there is no Davidic line. So the priests are the ones who are getting to tell this. What do they say? The winners write history.
Hmm.
And so the priests are the ones that are now in charge of this, and they're going to say, we'll fix this, we'll take care of it. And then what do you notice in these later sources, especially in these priestly sources? The priests are the most important ones, and the kings need to do what the priests say.
Hmm.
And so it becomes a priestly dominated document. Second Temple period, you start getting all, and by the time you get down into the time of Jesus, it's the high priest and the priesthood that kind of run the show. There is no king. They're
Yeah.
waiting for a Messiah. They're waiting for a Davidic Messiah to come back, but the priests are in control. And so they're the ones that put it together from all of these original sources. And that's what's been called in the past the documentary hypothesis. And there are different arguments over what the sources are and how they were pieced together and when, but that's essentially the idea. The theory, though, originally, and I like it, I like this theory, is that early stuff goes early, later stuff goes later. And they were just kind of putting it on a timeline. And then at a later time, they said, doesn't this stuff need to make logical sense, historical? Shouldn't we? And that's the editing and the redaction process, which happened at multiple periods.
Right. And we get within this Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your question. We
Yeah.
get in this question a lot of things. So I think we may need to come back and we can do a fully fleshed out conversation on the documentary hypothesis, because there's those that agree with it or disagree with it. There's the neo-documentary hypothesis now. If you're looking at scholars like Joel Baden that have written on this and how is this being adapted over time, and then all of this literature and style stuff that comes in, because as Bob has just mentioned, right, there are so many ways that this can go. What are we talking about? What style are we talking about? So Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your question and opening a significant can of worms. And yes, priestly source, if you're looking for the authoritative tradition, we have no biases here, but priestly source, maybe they know what they're talking about sometimes.
And just to let you all in on the joke that the inside Jordan's writing his dissertation on the priest, specifically on Phineas, but he's writing on how the priest came to dominate this tale, how they wrote this history of ancient Israel, and specifically how the priest came into control. I won't go into the specifics. We don't want to spoil the surprise here, but the question of, is the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, a product of these different sources, and were they edited and redacted? Yes. It just was. Moses didn't write it. It's a product of these sources. Now, which were the sources and where did they come from and at what time were they redacted and who redacted? That's where the debate is. The debate is not were there sources, and that's not the debate. We know there were sources. We know that there were different traditions, and we know that they were edited and harmonized and that kind of stuff. The question is, what was that process? That's where the scholarly debate is now.
So again, thank you, Constellation Pegasus, for your question and for your support. I think as we're talking about maybe traditions here, Bob, I want to turn to some comments from a recent video that we did on some supposed evidence for the Exodus. This is based off of that Daily Mail article, and this is going to be a little bit of a two-part response from us here. The first is we had some comments that were talking simply about the standing of the Daily Mail as a publication and why we're addressing this. And now we're not here to rank every publication. We would agree with some of these comments regarding the reputation of the Daily Mail as a paper. However, a part of why we felt like we should respond to that is, despite what you may or may not think about that, and depending on if you're in the UK and you deal with this publication regularly and you have a perspective, or if you're in the States, you may not know its reputation. Regardless of that, it was going everywhere. And so we had some of those comments, right? A lie can get around the world faster than the truth can put its shoes on. Regardless of where it's coming out, that stays true. So we do know there's some questions to be asked about where this came out from, but that was all the more reason for us to come into this. We had another question, though, or maybe a little bit of pushback on this, regarding some of the language that we used in talking about this. Right. The question was about the way you said there is no evidence of the Exodus. There is no direct evidence, is the phrase that one of the
Yeah.
commenters had a question
Right.
with, or some issue with, regarding this phrasing of
Sure.
direct evidence versus the publication talking about evidence, and maybe they're using it in a slightly different way. So,
Yeah.
Bob, direct evidence versus evidence. Is there
Yeah.
anything
Sure.
in the distinction here?
Yeah. And again, apologies if I wasn't clear. Any lack of clearness is me just trying to be polite. And First off, let's not get confused here. It's not like Journal of Biblical Literature, Daily Mail, Journal, Jewish
Yes.
Studies. We're not confused here. It's the Daily Mail, right?
Right.
So they're trying to get clicks. They reported on a story that I'm guessing the people who did that archaeological report are pulling out, what's left of my hair. And we said this last time. This was a story that completely misrepresented the claims of that archaeological
Hmm.
report. So let's just start there. Um, the Daily Mail's fun to read, but they misrepresented these claims. All right, full stop. When I was talking about there's no evidence for the Exodus. Now, when you say something like that, people will say, well, we have, trails, we have these nomadic routes in the desert, and there's evidence of nomadic routes. Okay. Then I say there's no direct evidence. What I mean by that is, well, there's evidence for the context. So here what I'm narrowing down to. Dan Brown writes historical fiction, right? Da Vinci Code, Angels and Demons, right? He is able to take this Robert Langdon character and write it into a historical context, right? And they're fun reads, and say whatever you want about him. He writes these incredibly popular stories that people follow, and then you trace them around, and it's like reading a movie script. You just go,
Hmm.
go, 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 and they're fun to read, turn into popular movies, etc. But what he's doing is he's writing this historical fiction, a fictional character into a historical context. And if somebody said, well, of course this is real, these places that he's talking about in London and in Paris and in Italy, those are real places. That's a
Right.
real statue. You wouldn't say that, therefore, that proves that Robert Langdon's a real person. You would say, no, that's the context of the story that he's writing. It's a historical fiction, right? These are historical places, and this is a historical event that happened, and he's just happening to be writing this into the story. And so when I say that there's evidence for the context of the Exodus, this is what I'm talking about. We have these ancient routes, these nomadic routes. We know there was an ancient Egypt. We know there was an ancient Israel, right? We know that there were runaway slaves, but we don't have evidence that slaves built the pyramids. In fact, we have the receipts from the Egyptian men who were paid to build
Hmm.
the pyramids. Go back and watch our interview with Kara Cooney from UCLA. She was talking about this. They now have discovered the receipts of the people who were paid to do this.
The old pay
So
stubs.
yeah, the pay stubs, we actually have those now. So we have these stories that are represented in the Bible because this is the foundation myth, the foundation story, as was told by the ancient Israelites, and they fixed it in here. And then when we go through archaeologically, we don't have it. And as I said last time, a wagon wheel at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba or the Red Sea or whatever is not evidence of an exodus. It's a maritime trade. There's boats, they sink. You're going to find some things like this. Now, is it even a wheel? We can have that
Right.
discussion as well. But this isn't evidence of the claims that are made in the Bible. Then you get into the internal contradictions. Well, when did it happen? The Bible gives two different dates. The Bible itself gives two different dates. So you've got the Bible, having an internal contradiction. By the way, look up on Google late Exodus versus early Exodus, and you'll see the controversy between confessional people who believe that the Exodus happened. They can't agree on when it happened. And you'll see the internal chronological problems with this. Then you'll have some other people who will say, well, we shouldn't expect to find any evidence.
Yes.
So the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So it could have happened.
And
Great.
this is that, well, if they're all everything is perishable, all of their items
Right.
should
Right.
have decayed. So yeah, we don't expect to find anything. We shouldn't find anything. So you can't use that against the claim.
And it's not, I mean, it's not an invalid argument, although you would expect it to line up with other things like the conquest, right? So if they did all of that and then they went in and conquered the land, that should line, but the conquest doesn't line up.
Right.
The conquest of starting with Jericho, right? It's not there. Kathleen Kenyon, did this. If you look at her archaeological reports, you look at how a lot of these other sites, again, out of the last 50 years coming out of Israel, the Israelites appear to have been Canaanites. They were always there. The Israelites were indigenous of the land. They were Canaanites who very slowly began to, I used the word tribe up. They began to form their groups. They moved into the highlands and into the lowlands, depending on whatever the threat was. They began to group up. And then once they became a powerful little ethnic group here, an identity, they said, well, we need a foundation story. And they began to tell these stories. And they incorporated stories about people coming in from the east and runaway slaves. And we got this wonderful, fascinating story called the Exodus. It's a beautiful story. I love the story. It's incorporated with these wonderful traditions about freedom and about liberation. And so it's a powerful thing, Passover and all, powerful story. But that doesn't mean that it's historical. And this is the thing that scholars, it's the thing that I had to wrestle with as a conservative Christian growing up, and then having to go, boy, how do I reconcile? And then having to just struggle with it and look at the evidence over and over and over and come to the realization that, oh, okay, does this have to be historical? Does it have to have happened in order for it to be great literature? No. Can you have a Jewish ethnic identity? Can you have this history? Can you have this camaraderie with fellow Jews? And this have to be, no, you don't. And then you begin to work through it. And it takes a long time. And it's a shock when you first discover it. But you go back and you look for this evidence and it's not there.
Yeah. And this, I think, tags well with the question we got earlier about why are these things coming together? That there are many ways to approach the text and purposes that can be found within the text, why stories are preserved or not preserved. So just because there isn't direct evidence for this, it doesn't mean that there's obviously a reason they chose to preserve this tradition. So there's still something there to be considered and reflected upon, regardless of the lack of evidence here. So yeah, that kind of thing. There's a lot of that going around, and there's always things connected with that. So we just wanted to do a little bit of a comeback moment there as we addressed that. JC, I see your question here as well about some specific texts discussing Second Temple capitals. And is this a sign related to hexafoils on Levantine ossuaries? We can look for some text recommendations for you. Off the top of my head, nothing comes immediately to mind about a text that I would say would be the one to go to. Bob, I don't know if anything comes straight to your mind, but we can definitely come back to you, JC, with a response about something that can maybe share or shed some light on the specifics of the development of these. Is this more likely to have a geometrical understanding given by Euclid's elements? Proposition 1 came before this. Or again, well, let us follow up with you there. That's, I think, maybe a little specific, unless, Bob, off the top of your mind.
No, I'm Euclid, we're starting to talk about, I just got back from vacation. So again, thank you, JC, for
You're not in the geometrical mind this morning.
Yeah. I did manage to to shave up a little bit here, but JC, thanks again for the homework. It's paid homework, so I got to do it. So again, thanks for the question, but this is a good discussion.
Yeah.
When you're looking at, we're asking about if there's no evidence that it happened, this is a valid argument, because the analogy that people, the New Testament people turn around and say is, okay, what about Jesus? I'm the first one to say we don't have any hard evidence for Jesus as well. Where's the evidence that proves it? No, but I'm the first to say, but you can make a pretty good circumstantial case. Bart Ehrman wrote an entire book on this, right? Did Jesus exist or something like that? You can make a pretty good circumstantial case, but I'm the first to admit there's no direct hard evidence for Jesus. And so then you have these mythicists who say, well, then he didn't exist. It was co-opted from these other myths, these other tales, these existing tales, and Jesus was concocted into the story. You know, like the Exodus. I think those are two different things. Um, Certainly on a different scale, a different time period. Um, I still think you can make a pretty good circumstantial case that there was a messianic, a person embodying what Josephus sees as all of these messianic pretenders.
Hmm.
Although I don't think that Josephus necessarily mentioned Jesus, he was added in there at a later time. But I can see how one of these people's popping up and had some followers and carried that message around. And did he do all the miracles? We can have that debate. But I think that's different from the Exodus story. We don't have any evidence, but we certainly can explain where this foundation myth came from.
I want to turn to a Patreon question that we had submitted here while we're talking about
Mhm.
potential messiahs, Bob, about King Saul. And maybe there's some surprise here in the audience that I think you'll get to in this as we go through. The question came
Mhm.
as follows: How did King Saul die? How
Yeah.
did King Saul die? And you may, right, if we could walk through briefly, give the spark notes of how King Saul died. And then I think let's also talk a little bit, if we're expanding their question, about David's response to King Saul's death as well, and
Right.
how this is being used here. So, first, how does Saul die, Bob?
Okay. So this is one of these trick questions, right? The answer is yes. There's two different ways that the Bible says King Saul dies. You find one at the end of First Samuel and one at the beginning of Second Samuel. So at the end of First Samuel 31, you have uh, this ill-fated war against the Philistines. First Samuel's out there with his son Jonathan, and they're out there fighting. And if you look down at First Samuel 31, um, he basically gets mortally wounded, and so he says to the guy that carries around his armor, when you're the king, you have, it's like a caddy, right? He
Mm-hmm.
carries around
Yeah.
your armor, and he says, I'm mortally wounded. I'm going to die, right? It's, we often think of death as like an instant thing because we live in an era with guns, right? Um, this guy has been stabbed. He's going to die. And so uh First Samuel 31, you have this text. Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, so that these uncircumcised may not come and thrust me through and make sport of me. He's basically saying, I need you to kill me. I need you to finish me. I'm gonna die.
Mm-hmm.
I'm dead. I'm not dead, but I'm gonna die. And we've had this conversation before about did the serpent lie when he said, you will surely die, you know, if you eat of the fruit. And okay, they didn't drop dead, but they began the process of dying, because dying is a process. If you've ever spent time in hospice care, dying is a process. Sometimes it's quick, sometimes it's slow, but it's a process. Saul knows he's going to die. And he's like, finish me so the Philistines don't come and get me and then trot me around, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cut off my head and show it off and drag my body, this kind of stuff. But the armor bearer was unwilling, for he was terrified. You can't kill the king. You're asking me to kill the king. I know what's going to happen to me if I kill the king. I'm not going to do it. So Saul, according to First Samuel 31, took his own sword and fell on it. And this is where we get the expression, he fell on his sword, right? He took one for the team, right? He fell on his own sword. That way he's dead, and the Philistines can't claim that he killed him. Saul killed himself. He committed
Right.
suicide. Pardon me, he committed suicide. Now, when the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell on his own sword, because now he's responsible for Saul dying, and Saul's dead. You can't be the one standing there with a. So he falls on his own sword. So his Saul, his three sons, the armor bearer, everyone's dead. And what happens? The Philistines come and find him. They strip his armor. They take that and they put that up as a trophy in the temple. They cut off his head and they parade that around. They got to prove that they killed Saul. And then they take his body, and I think they piked it up on yeah, they put his army in the temple of Astarte, and then they fastened his body to the wall of Bet Sham.
Mm-hmm.
So they basically said, these are our trophies,
This is
right?
the,
They did
yeah.
exactly what Saul didn't want.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the end of First Samuel. Saul says, please kill me. The armor bearer says, no way, right? And he falls on his sword. The armor bearer falls on his sword. That's what the Bible says. Now, if you read Second Samuel 1 and 2, Saul says to the armor bearer, "Hey, I'm mortally wounded. Kill me." And the armor bearer says, "I don't know." And he goes, "Look, stand over me and do this." And so the armor bearer does it. Okay. And then he runs back to report to King David. And when he gets back to King David, he says, "The army fled from the battle." This is 2 Samuel 2:4. Fled from the battle, and Saul and his son Jonathan also died. And he said, "How do you know that they died?" And he said, "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and Saul was leaning on his spear." Basically, he may have been trying to off himself while the chariots and the horsemen. And he saw me, and he said, "Who are you?" And I told him, "I'm an Amalekite." He just happens to be a foreigner, resident, a resident living in, fighting on behalf of the Israelites. But he just conveniently happens to be an Amalekite that's living, fighting with the Israelites. He said, "Come stand over me and kill me, for the convulsions are in. It's agonizing. Just put me out of my misery." Same
Right.
as before, and yet my life still lingers. But this time he does it. So I stood over him and killed him, for I knew that that he couldn't live after this. So after I did what the king ordered me to do,
He told me
I
to.
took his right. The king gave me an order. I have to do what the king orders me to do, right? So, but at least what I did was I took his crown and I took his bracelet, his royal bracelet, and his ID basically, and I brought it back to you, King David. Look, I saved the Philistines from taking this and parading it around, right? I took the crown on his head, and David took his clothes and he ripped them, right? And he mourned, and he tells the guy standing next, one of the guards there, "Come and strike this guy down." So they killed him, and he said, "Your blood be on your head, because you killed the Lord's anointed." Basically, you lifted a hand against the Lord's anointed. And so then he lamented the death of Saul and Jonathan, and I'm like, this has always troubled me, because David is now punishing the guy who's obeying King Saul for doing something. What's the word? He was putting him out of his misery. He was doing something. Um, the
He
word
was
is slipping
following
me now.
orders. Yeah, but
Yeah,
in
but
the
he was
text,
he
he was
was
ordered to do this. He
he
was
was
doing
it
that.
was euthanasia, right? It
Yeah.
was he was putting him down. He was going to die, and he was in massive pain, and he put him down as Saul commanded him to, as his king commanded him to. Two things. One, you've got two different ways that the Bible says that Saul died, right? One says that Saul fell on his own sword because the armor bearer wouldn't kill him, and then the armor bearer killed himself. So
Hmm.
Saul did it to himself. You've got another one where Saul's mortally wounded, and he tells this Amalekite who's coming by to do this, and he does it. And then David kills this guy who's trying to do the right thing, right? "I obeyed the king, and here I'm bringing you this." And the question is, A, do we have a contradiction? Well, it appears that way. We have two different deaths of Saul. And then you have this story of, why would David do this in the second one? And it goes back to what we were saying earlier about the priest taking over and wanting to tell a story that promotes the priesthood, versus perhaps there was another contingency that was loyal to the crown, or let's say loyal to David, and they want to make David look as good as possible. Remember, there are several instances in the Bible where they want to make sure that it doesn't look like David is usurping the throne from Saul.
Right.
So you have this story about David's hiding in a cave, and Saul goes in there to relieve
Relieve
himself,
himself.
right? Right, yeah. And Saul could, I mean, David could just kill Saul, but instead he cuts off the back of of his uh his robe, of his skirt, and when it walks out, and he's like, "Boy, it's kind of breezy." And David's like, "Ha ha ha, I cut this off. I could have killed you, but I didn't." Or he sneaks into camp and he takes his spear and he goes, "I could have stabbed you in the head, but I didn't." Right? All of these times David could have killed Saul, but I didn't, right? And when this guy actually lifts his hand against the God's anointed, against the king, "I'm going to kill the guy who did it, even though you were just following." He's going out of his way to show that he didn't kill Saul, and he's going to punish anyone who did. So this is a very pro-monarchy set of texts, right? That this second Samuel one, even though it contradicts the first Samuel instance, is a pro-David. It's a
Right.
very, very pro-David, pro-monarchy. Whereas the second Samuel one, the guy is saying, I'm not going to kill Saul. I'm not going to kill King Saul. And this other guy, um, Saul falls on his own sword, and then the armor bearer does the thing that he's supposed to do. But David has nothing to do with this. David just becomes the king, right?
Hmm.
Or will soon after this. So is there a contradiction? Yes. By the way, it's part of an ongoing theme of the problem with Saul's reign. Scholars will talk about this. If you look in the Bible, I always ask this trivia question in my class. How long did Saul reign as king? What year did Saul, how old was Saul when he became king? The Hebrew Bible leaves it blank. Saul was blank number of years when he became king, and he reigned for blank years. It's one of they're having the formula in there, but it doesn't fill in the number. The other problem is the story of the birth of Samuel may have been altered, changed, mixed, whatever word you want to use, with the story of the birth of Saul, because when Hannah, when Samuel's mom says, "Oh, I'm going to give," and she says, "Because I asked God," and it's Shaul, right? It's the verbal root for to ask, the name of Saul, not the name of Samuel. And so there are a lot of problems with Samuel's the most problematic text in the Bible, right? It's just got a lot of uh, textual errors, textual problems that we need to work through. But the death of Saul, yeah, he dies two different ways, and it probably has something to do with there's a source that's neutral, and then there's a pro-David source that's
Yeah.
going out of its way to show that David did everything he could to not kill Saul. Why? Because he's camped with the Philistines, right?
David's got
Saul's chasing
problems.
him. Yeah, he's got problems. He's done a lot of things that looks like he's trying to take the throne away from Saul.
And I want to add in, as well, as we're talking about wrinkles here, if
Yeah.
we look towards First Chronicles 10 as well, where we get
Yeah.
some of the repeating of First Samuel, and there's this lovely tagline, as Chronicles is wont to do. They love to add a little bit of explanation. We're fixing things a little bit more. Down in verse 13, we get a repetition of some of this story, but then we get a description that says, "So Saul died for his unfaithfulness. He was unfaithful to the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord. Moreover, he had consulted a medium seeking guidance and did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore, the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, son of Jesse." So even more of this, no, no, no. It's not David doing anything improper.
Right.
David's not seeking the throne.
Right.
Making sure that we can smooth out any of the wrinkles or confusion that you may have had.
Right.
Saul was bad. David is good. The Lord kills Saul. The Lord hands this over to David.
Right. And remember, we've said this quite a lot. If you take Samuel and Kings, take a Bible, Samuel and Kings, and put it here, and take Chronicles. Chronicles is essentially rewriting Samuel and Kings at a later period.
Right.
So Chronicles is fixing, it's editing, it's sometimes it harmonizes, sometimes it recognizes some of these problems in Samuel and in Kings, and it tries to, and this is where people talk about there's so many contradictions in the Bible. A lot of them are discrepancies between Chronicles and
Mm-hmm.
Samuel, just because the numbers are different. But Chronicles does another thing, and that is it adds these theological comments.
Right.
This is why this happened, right? Uh, we're told in Samuel that uh, the reason Samuel, the prophet Samuel, takes the kingdom, he says, God has taken the kingdom away from you and has given it to another because you didn't kill everyone that God told you to kill among the Amalekites, right? This king, what's this bleating of sheep that I still hear, right? Why didn't you kill the king? Why is he still alive? And so because he didn't commit, full genocide against the Amalekites, God's taking the kingdom away from Saul. But here it says, it was your unfaithfulness, writ large, generic, but also the medium. You can't do
Yeah.
that. You can't talk to mediums. And so, by the way, his encounter with the medium worked. He was
Worked.
able to conjure up Samuel from the dead.
Yeah, you
So
did a thing you shouldn't have done that definitely worked, but we don't want you doing that anymore. Saul was bad to consult the woman of Endor tradition, which we can do that one in a future day because it's such a fun story that
well,
gets
that's why
cast
you
in its
can't.
own way. But
That's why you can't consult a medium, because it works, right?
yeah,
You can't talk to witches because witches are powerful.
yeah, they can summon Samuel up. They can get you your advice, but it's not going to go well for you, right? The end result of the advice is that your things are going to go poorly, which they do conveniently. But yeah, how does Saul die? Yeah, which one are you reading? Why does Saul die? Which one are we looking at? But all of this then getting pointed again towards how are we talking about David? How is this concerned with David? Which I think is one of those fun as we're today, we're spending so much time today talking about how we're reading the text and why. Just another one of these examples.
I would love to see a sketch done of that Endor thing. One, because there's so many issues with it, right? One, she calls him a god, right? She says,
Yes.
"What are you seeing?" Is I see an Elohim. So,
Yeah.
she calls him a, and then it
Talking
always
about
gets
Samuel
translated.
coming up.
Right. She's talking about Samuel coming up. She goes, "I see an Elohim." And it always gets translated a divine being, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you got to sell Bibles. But the other is uh, when he comes up, Samuel's basically said, I'm telling you this now, the same thing I told you before. Let me go back to sleep, right? So he's basically, he's basically going, God, why'd you wake me up? I'm
Leave
going to
me
tell you the
alone.
same thing now that I told you before.
Yeah.
It's just to me, it's a fun story because it works.
Yeah.
She goes, "You're Saul." She goes, "No, no, no, just do this for me." And so she does it.
Yeah.
We'll do a whole other thing on that, anyways.
But yeah, so thank you for your question about Saul and David. And there's a lot with Saul and David I know that we haven't necessarily gotten into. We've had some people asking about when are we going to get into these. We want to, spread that material around a little bit because there's lots of good stories in there. We have done some things about, like how many times does Goliath die in some of these, but a future day we'll come in and we'll talk about Saul a little bit more. We'll talk about David a little bit more. So don't worry if you're chomping at the bit wanting to hear about some particular things on David and Saul. We will come back around to that in the future. Bob, as we're coming to the end here, I want to ask a question jumping back a little bit towards Genesis if we're leaving some of the monarchy stuff aside, staying in our textual questions from today. This question came to us from Ryan about Cain and Abel. And their question is, why does Cain kill Abel?
This is a good question. Cain is jealous of Abel because the Bible says that God preferred Abel's sacrifice, right? But Cain took his produce from his field. If I remember correctly, he was a farmer, so he brought up I'm guessing some veggies, and he offers this sacrifice, the fruits of his labors. And Abel was pastoral, and he has these animals, and he offers a blood sacrifice essentially. And the Bible, if I remember correctly, says the Lord preferred or favored Abel's sacrifice. That's it. Doesn't say why.
Mm-hmm.
That's all left to a theological interpretation, which is typically from scholars that the Bible is written, especially these early stories, from a standpoint of uh, pastoral, nomadic. Uh, uh, it favors this nomadic pastoral sensibility,
Yeah.
whereas the agrarian, where you're settling and you're trying to basically tame the land yourself and you're responsible for your own product. You're not just trusting God and you're just wandering and you're just letting the Lord multiply your crops, and that's a much harder lifestyle. You're just dependent on the elements. You hope bandits don't come. Whereas you're building in cities and you start to build out farms, you're taming the land, and the Bible seems to favor, at least early on, this nomadic, this pastoral lifestyle. So that's usually the interpretation that's given, that this lifestyle that's a blood sacrifice lifestyle that favors just trusting in God for everything. That's the one that God favors. Whatever your interpretation, and there are lots of other interpretations, but that's
Mm-hmm.
the traditional one, that God favors this blood sacrifice over the fruits and veggies sacrifice. It is not because, God doesn't like vegetarians and stuff like that.
This
It's not, it's
this
none of
is
that.
just because God likes steak, right? Isn't that God's
Right. Well, he does like
anti-salad?
barbecue.
And
He likes the,
yeah,
he likes a
after
good
the
barbecue,
flood,
but
God
no, it's,
enjoys that smell.
it's an aroma pleasing to the Lord. No, but
Mm-hmm.
it's this idea. It's probably that the Bible's still favoring this pastoral nomadic lifestyle, right? These guys that are wandering in the desert, this Exodus story, that's still kind of what's favored. They don't like cities, right? Bad things happen in cities,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's where the sin is. Whereas, by the way, this idea hasn't gone away. Look at any modern election, any commentary. The sin is happening in the cities, whereas out in the country, we just have a peaceful home, down home life. We take care of ourselves. This commentary has not
Mm-hmm.
gone away. It hasn't changed, right?
Yeah, that
What's they
ideal
what
in that
Yeah, it's
ideal idea, if I can just get back to nature, if I can get to the woods, if I can get to one of these places, that everything will be better, and settling
or
down
my
is
country home where we make things ourselves, we grow our own food, which is interesting because that it's moved one, right? It's the whole farming thing was what Abel was doing. And these are, pastoral nomads. That's what was Abel was doing. Anyways, Cain, his idea is he's jealous for whatever reason. We think that's the reason. He's jealous because God favors Abel's sacrifice. He's just it's a first sibling rivalry. God likes one. Bible says, according to the Bible,
yeah,
that he
yeah.
that he preferred one of the brothers' sacrifice better, and Cain just gets upset and kills him.
I
That's it. The first family becomes the first family murder, and now you've got now so that would be the first true crime podcast, right? On the death of Cain killing Abel.
Yeah,
And
Seth
then you're
starts a podcast afterwards talking
right.
about what happened
Seth is like, let
in
me
the
tell you what happened to my
family.
brothers.
Hmm.
Right. Yeah. No, but that's the idea, is that it was just jealousy. And what we find in a lot of these early stories, these early stories, the fall, what the Christians call the fall, but it's this idea of the serpent tempting Adam and Eve to eat of the fruit, the loss of immortality, jealousy, murder. It's these fundamental emotions, these feelings
Hmm.
are woven into the stories. That the way I like to say it is the things that make us human, for better and for worse, right? Love, uh, hate, jealousy, pride, all of these things get woven into these early stories. And it begins the process of telling us who we are as humans. And then they gradually work into who we are as Israelites, who we are, and then who we ought to be as God's chosen people. And that basically is how these stories are. So by the time you get down to the establishment of Israel, the priests then come in and say, here's how we need you to behave. Here's
Yes.
what it means to be Jewish, basically. And that's where you go. That's the history of Israel. Here's where we came from. Here's why God made us. Here's the things you're going to struggle with, right? And here's what we need you to be doing now.
I think, as two Californians, we have to make the plug here as well. If we're talking about Cain and Abel, for East of Eden, if you haven't read East of Eden and you like the Cain and Abel story, John Steinbeck's rendition of this is a wonderful read. If you like to consider these themes more broadly that Bob's talking about here, that we get in some of this story, it's a wonderful read. It's an enjoyable listen if you're an audiobook fan. But check out East of Eden as well, as you're mixing up your Bible reading, as you're doing your Bible reading over the summer. Sometimes you got to sprinkle something else in there as well. I think that's all we have time for today, Bob. So I know we've been a little bit all over the place. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening along. If you're watching this on replay, or if you're listening to this in the podcast version, thank you for tuning in. Next month, we'll have another one of these live that you can join us and ask your questions live. However, as we mentioned before, You can always submit questions in advance, either through our email, or you can join us on Patreon and submit questions that way as well. We're at Excavator on Patreon. Our email is down in the description, Bible-Archaeology at uiowa.edu. Wherever you're finding us, be sure to subscribe so you can keep up to date with everything that's coming out. You can find us on all the platforms that you might expect to, but thank you for tuning in. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan Jones for Dr. Bob Cargill. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Go Hawks.
Go Hawks.